It's very stimulating and interesting discussion. It is my great pleasure to introduce both Tamara Meyers and Mona Gleason. I'll just give you very brief bios for both of them. I know both Tamara and Mona from different contexts, and they both do really wonderful work. Tamara came here from the University of Winnipeg quite recently. She's an assistant professor in the history department and is the author of a book called Caught, Montreal's Modern Girls and the Law, 1869 to 1945, and co-editor of a book called Negotiating Identities in 19th and 20th Century Montreal, published by UBC Press. Her research explores the intersections of the history of youth, child welfare, juvenile justice, and gender and sexuality. And I know that UBC is really very happy to have her. And in the context of the Faculty of Education, we're also really pleased that she agreed to come and do this work at, as I was reminded by some unnamed sources in the room, of how difficult the term is at this particular time. It's also my great pleasure to introduce Mona. I won't say that when, I'll just let them hand it over to each other so you get the opportunity to do it now. She's my very dear friend and colleague in the Department of Ed Studies. Her research and teaching focuses on the history of children and youth in English Canada over the 19th and 20th centuries, and her publications have explored the role of popular psychology in defining ideas about normal families, the role of experts in shaping ideas about good parenting, the role of medical and educational professionals in constructing healthy children, and most recently, the representation of children labeled disabled in professional discourse. Mona, remind me the title of your book, because I don't have it here.
It's called Normalizing the Ideal.
Yeah, Normalizing the Ideal.
That's the first one.
That's the first one. Yes, I know there's another on the way. So let's put our hands together for these two wonderful scholars and listen to their work.
Thank you, Joe, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me. It's nice to come across campus and to hang out with people who are not necessarily historians. Joe's invitation included a description of what they're aiming for today, and it involved moral panics. And I've been doing some research into the history of youth and policing at mid-20th century Canada. And of course, the 1940s, especially the Second World War, was rife with amoral panic over youth. And the moral panic from the 1940s might today seem somewhat quaint, absurd, or silly. But my argument is that it was highly productive in that it resulted in new technologies of surveillance and discipline aimed broadly at young people, and that these would, in subsequent decades, be targeted at racialized youth. So for the time being, what we have is the emergence of particular disciplinary ideas and strategies aimed at youth. So this era of the 1940s marks a watershed moment when police work was fundamentally altered towards what I call child and youth consciousness. We can see this in the development of what I'll talk about today, the morality squads, curfews, and the sports solution for what were known as pre-delinquent youth. So I want to get to, first of all, this notion of this era of a moral panic over youth. The heightened regulation of youth in 1940s Canada was the result of anxiety over who was minding the children, child protection, and fears for the future. A moral panic followed the absent father, the working mother, the latchkey child, and a new category, the working teen, which is problematized, and partly because of the high mobility of youth, especially in my work focuses on Montreal, especially from the countryside into the city during the early war years. Now, if you'll recall, Canada entered the Second World War on the side of the Allies in September of 1939, and following that date, there was a massive recruitment of men and a mobilization of the economy, which would include women and children both. And so this is a time of dramatic social change and dislocation, and uncontrollable youth was predicted, even by 1939, as one of the casualties of the war experience. So in Montreal, of course, was the workshop of Canada, a very important industrial center from the 19th century through the mid-20th. And this would attract youth from not only the countryside, but across the country. So there was, of course, shifting notions about what youth were necessary for, and the kind of participation that they would have in war work. And this would apply for both men, or boys, and girls. And it was girls in particular that were seen as highly problematic as they moved into hotel work, replacing men and boys, hotel work, restaurant work, and so on. So in the service industry, and they're seen as particularly vulnerable. So this is going to lead to, in part, a moral panic over youth. By 1941, Canadians had learned that Britain was besieged not only by a foreign enemy, but by juvenile crime, which was a homegrown problem. Discussions in the media pointed to youth's antisocial behavior as allegedly caused by the wartime environment of blackouts, absent parents, and ever-present death and destruction. So slowly over the course of the early 1940s, vulnerable and delinquent Canadian children made headline news. And in Montreal, what we see is discursively a youth problem being discussed quite widely by 1942. By 1944, there was considered a full-blown wave of juvenile crime. And this was reflected in popular media. What I have here is an advertisement for a movie that opened, it's a Hollywood movie, that opened up in Montreal in the spring of 1944. This is an advertisement for Montreal Snowden Theatre. It's a Jackie Cooper Gale Storm film that examines the tragic life of a 17-year-old girl, Judy. And this copy is actually specific to Montreal. Here for the first time in Montreal, the real answer to the question that is troubling the whole civilized world. Where are your children tonight? Here's the shocking story of modern youth, so realistically told, so amazingly true and timely, that it might well have been taken from the case histories of our own crowded juvenile court. So what happens in this morality tale was that Judy, as an orphan who is sent to live with her brother and sister-in-law during the war, these guardians are presented as too preoccupied to pay attention to her, and although the neglect is associated with patriotic war duties, they are still seen to be negligent. They assume that Judy can keep house for them in the daytime before she leaves for her lunch counter job, which she occupies in the evenings. So at the restaurant, during the evening, she meets Danny, played by a young Jackie Cooper, who's also the product of a neglectful home. In this case, his mother is too busy with her club work to pay attention to him. And the pair venture out into the night, hitting a nightclub, thus beginning a series of dramatic events that will eventually lead to, of course, a midnight joyride, and then the shocking murder of a gas station owner, and criminal charges. Now, because Judy is 17, she is taken into the juvenile court. And so a large part of this movie is about her juvenile court experiences. The moral lessons of the film are none too subtle, that community and parental indifference and neglect to youth lead in inevitable fashion to delinquency, crime, loss of innocence, and death. All right, so this is, of course, almost laughable to today's standards, but at the time, the press took it very seriously, and the juvenile court judges remarked on how it did reflect exactly what was going on in the juvenile court of the day. Now, having done a lot of research into the juvenile court in Montreal, they're actually overstating the case by far, and it's not true that many people are being brought in because they're associated with murders. Juvenile delinquency, if it were to be increasing, it was the same old thing. Boys are stealing, girls are immoral. So more of the same, but there's more concentration on youth. And why was this? In part, I think it's got to do with the place of children during wartime. The reaction to the film speaks to the significant changes in the definition of childhood and adolescence during the war, but also to the experience of a particular set of adolescents in those mid-teen years. And the way that the problem is cast in the early 1940s is very much that it is a problem with our kids. And in Montreal, this is sort of complex mix of French-Canadian, Anglo-Protestant, and Jewish youth who were going bad. Of course, youth symbolically and practically occupy a very important role during wartime. Their value is demonstrated in the need for their labor, but also in recognition of their future roles in reproduction, which is linked to successful Reconstruction after the war. And Canadians were obsessed with Reconstruction after the war. They started talking about planning for the war by the early 1940s. So children are, of course, tomorrow's nation, and within Quebec, it is during these years that the Quebec government decides to set up a Ministry of Youth. This is the first one that will be set up in Canada in 1949. So as barometers of health and stability of society as a whole, children and youth became objects of scrutiny during the war. So it's not surprising then that so-called bad or neglected children captured the imagination of politicians, policymakers, schools, parents, and the media. And so the panic, the moral panic over youth about these neglected kids that are going to go bad and may end up like Judy in juvenile court associated with a murder. This would lead to, this was expressed in a variety of different places, in particular in the media and a lot of chatter with experts over youth, including juvenile justice authorities. But the police were also concerned, and they had proof. They could demonstrate this numerically, that in fact youth had gone wild or bad. This is the annual arrests for boys, and you see this is the graph really takes off in 1941. So there's tremendous growth. Similarly for girls, you see the same kind of projection up. So 42, 43, there's, they can point to this. This isn't just a moral panic. This isn't overstating the case, but in fact, kids are going crazy. Now, of course, we read this as, in fact, there's more police activity with youth rather than youth are so much different than they were prior to the war. So what did they do? Well, in Montreal, that film, by the way, the film comes out during the same week as Montreal's Juvenile Delinquency Prevention Week. And this is a week-long investigation into the problems of neglected and delinquent youth. This advertisement is quite interesting in the sense that the category of youth that you've got here is quite different than Gail Storm and Jackie Cooper, who are older adolescent, who are obviously up to something different. But this is about protecting kids, making sure that these kids who could be pre-delinquents will not take the wrong track. So as much as this looks like they're going to talk about young kids and innocence and so on, the opening session is in fact on youth and VD, venereal disease. So they were considered, even though they're projecting this is what we're aiming for, preserving. What they're actually interested in is youth as vectors of disease and the slippery slope from immoral behavior to a public health crisis. So what did they do? Well, first, the campaigns for curfew laws, which are not new to the Second World War, but in fact become extremely successful during the Second World War, really take off. And we see the support for curfew laws coming from places where traditionally people had opposed it. So people who felt that the family should be in control of their kids at the state should not step into that role. That all of a sudden is set aside because the curfew was now seen, if mothers are absent because they're working, if fathers are overseas, then the curfew could be what they called a home builder. So there's this sort of discursive construction of what this mechanism could do, and it's seen as extremely benevolent as opposed to coercive, which is what it was. Juvenile curfews in Canada date back to the 19th century. They're a new mechanism in the 19th century, and they are still with us today. I would say that they're spread right across the country. Often they are directed at Aboriginal youth today. So where pockets, there's perception that Aboriginal youth are misbehaving, are criminal, they bring in curfew law, and everyone applauds them because they believe that this will reduce crime. So a 10 o'clock curfew for certain racialized populations. So during the Second World War, again, you see the image of the innocent youth being saved by this home builder. The children's, what they called a sortie nocturne, the nighttime adventures, were identified as one of the great evils of our time. And so in 1942, the municipal government passes a curfew law for children under 14 who are not escorted. And that escort is a very specific category. You had to be an adult, a guardian, or a parent. So following the passage of the bylaw in September of 1942, children were routinely rounded up after curfew hour. And these are very specific streets that are, of course, located in working class areas within Montreal. Some of these kids are out on the street earning money. They're selling newspapers. They are or selling whatever they can. Sometimes it's coal or pieces of wood that they've picked up. So they're part of a casual market, and they are picked up by the police. So from the juvenile court records, we see 11, 12, 13-year-old kids being brought to court and being fined 50 cents or $1. Failure to be able to pay that amount would result in incarceration in the detention home. So I would read that as quite a significant move to discipline, incarcerate very young people. So even though the detention home was seen as something kinder and more gentler than a jail, it is in fact the withdrawal of these kids' rights, the separation of them from their homes. All right. The second element that, or second solution was the expansion of the morality squad. And it fell to the juvenile morality squad, which is centered in the police force, to operationalize curfew measures. So prior to the establishment of the juvenile morality squad in 1936, the Montreal police had tracked down lost loitering and lost and loitering children, and also young people who were in breach of municipal regulations or those who had committed crimes. So children and youth always fell into the purview of the police, but it wasn't a focus. And what we see with the emergence of the juvenile morality squad was a new era of youth-targeted policing with specialized youth divisions, which will be increasingly important as we move across the 20th century. So, and they're also going to discover new sort of bad adolescent behavior, as I'll show in a moment. When the Juvenile Morality Squad was founded in 1936, it was a very small squad. It was 2 officers, 2 men, who were, whose job it was to interrupt the immoral relationships between adults and youth. So their target, in fact, was not youth so much as the adults responsible for their aberrant behavior. So this might be seen as a moment when the police were interested in tracking down people who were involved in incest or abusive relationships. They could use Articles 29 and 33 of the Juvenile Delinquents Act to, in fact, bring all adults into juvenile court. But this was, with two officers, quite an insignificant force. They certainly did do some work towards trying to make adults pay, basically, for leading kids astray. But it's during the Second World War that this morality squad really expands and changes its orientation. Responding to the delinquency panic and anxiety over the mounting numbers of apparent latchkey children, morality officers focused on the surveillance of youth in public places through what they called tours of inspection of restaurants, pool halls, bowling halls, and the like. One of the things that they specifically did was to round up so-called immoral teenagers. And the morality squad would start to collect couples from parks and dance halls and other public spaces, in some senses paralleling the work of the female patrol officers that we had seen in Montreal during the First World War, whose target really was female sexual delinquency. Now, but unlike those patrol women. By the Second World War, the morality squad comprised male officers, and its target was not restricted to female delinquents, but youth of both sexes. So we have, for the first moment, with this morality squad, the targeting of male sexuality, male heterosexuality at first. So although the court and the police had a long history of regulating girls' sexuality, it really didn't bother with boys until the 1940s. And this can partly be explained by the concern over venereal disease within the city. The clinical language of the court cast the boy as sexual predator, but a closer examination reveals a complex adolescent interaction, intergenerational tension, and concern over public health and declining morality. So in the early years of the 40s, heterosexual couples were picked up by the courts or the morality squad and brought to court by parents, resulting in accusations launched at boys for allegedly encouraging girls to leave home and have sex with them. So what we get from the morality squad's records is a sense of male sexuality or adolescent boy sexuality. And we see that the variety of sites for sexual encounters among teens during the early war years. So in particular, city parks and cheap room rentals in the city's East End were not only targeted, but they also seemed to be really important in terms of an emerging sort of sexual landscape for kids. Boys who were involved in casual sex were sometimes identified by female sex delinquents. And so what we see is girls almost getting revenge. So they had been targeted for so long, long sexual histories being taken since the 1910s in juvenile court. By this time, they start to listen to the girls and take down the names of the boys and go after them as well. And so, of course, this continues to be gendered, where a boy might be taken in, sent for a medical exam. If he's found not to have venereal disease, he's sent home with approximately $5 to $10 fine. In 1942, Quebec had decided that the age of juvenile should be raised from under 16 to under 18. So we have the records of boys who were 16 and 17 years of age, and sort of some details about where they spent their leisure hours and also where they worked and so on, and who they dated, and the sexual roles that they played. What's interesting about their stories is it seems from the records that they are not, their stories are not couched in shame in the way that the girls' stories seem to be. The use of pardon tales seems to be a lot less evident. Just after the war, the morality squad discovered yet another avenue of youthful sexuality to monitor and correct. By 1946, the morality squad in Montreal is 30 strong. And the head of the morality squad, Ovila Hilche, who is here interviewed by an important broadcaster, this is in the 1950s, he spoke frequently to the media to ensure that the public was cognizant of its broad role in correcting police behavior. And in particular, Pelche is the one that exposes the 1946 homosexuality crisis in Montreal. And this is really targeting young gay men. In 1946, his morality squad talked about discovering a homosexuality ring, as he called it, that was operating in Montreal. And he, to quote him, one would say that as a general rule, immorality, homosexuality, and criminal delinquency go together. He attributed the immoral actions of 14-year-old boys to the influences of depraved adult men and older adolescent boys who initiated them into such practices. There's also other constables associated with the morality squad who went after cross-dressing young men. And so we have from these records sort of some sense about Montreal's gay subculture that did have a very specific youthful angle to it that is what was getting used by the morality squad. So the Juvenile Morality Squad worked throughout the war and the early post-war years with the juvenile court to control adolescent sexuality and uphold curfew laws. They would brag, Peltier would brag that by the 1940s that he had reduced the delinquency problem by 50%. And the last thing that the morality squad would get involved in as we head into 1947 is the emergence of what are called police juvenile clubs. And this is what I call the sports solution. These are clips from a documentary that was done on these new police juvenile clubs that are meant to be, they're secular clubs. They're meant to bring together all parts of Montreal culture, and they are spread throughout the city, located at police stations. And there's something that's a little bit odd here, that the notion was that they could socialize young boys, give them not gang colors, but police colors. And so kids would get their police badges, wear police colors, and thereby substituting their desire to be part of gangs. And this was targeting boys 10 to 17 years of age. And so this is from the video. They showed these boys fighting, and the next thing you know, they're getting their police badge and they're playing volleyball. So I'll just show you. So here it is, the Police Club for Boys. This is from the 1954 documentary. This is within the police station that the police would play roles as coaches and teach the boys, I think, from hockey to volleyball. They would teach them boxing and increasingly music. So there are music classes as well. One of the other thing that really attracted kids, though, was the free access to see professional sports. So kids, as many as 80,000 by 1954, were lining up for free admission to see the Montreal Royals baseball team or to see professional hockey teams down at the Forum. So the idea was that under the supervision of policemen, these team members would gain guidance and instruction in these sports, embrace team spirit, and at the same time a sound appreciation of the friendly neighborhood policeman, which I think is in and of itself quite insidious. Also, wearing, in Montreal, the hockey sweater is extremely important. They had the police sweater with the police logo on it. Okay, so in the early 1940s, Montreal was in the grips of a delinquency panic, like many other cities across North America, and indeed, certainly in the UK as well. In reaction to the rising delinquency rates, authorities blamed negligent and absent parents for the new youth problem, but took the opportunity to expand the police interaction with youth, and this would far outlast the war. Curfew laws, for example, would remain on the books until the 1960s. Then in most municipalities they're taken away and then reinstated in more recent times. So the new weapons against substandard parenting and the disruptive character of the rising generation, including expanding the work of the morality squad. And this allowed for new categories of bad youthful behavior to emerge, for boys' sexuality to be targeted, and increasingly for surveillance of gay youth. So from the statistics of the Montreal Police Department, we see a dramatic increase in the corps of officers dedicated to the surveillance and regulation of youth, and this is why I call it a kind of child or youth consciousness. That in some cases it seems pretty innocuous to bring them volleyball games, but it also meant that on these tours of inspection, they are heading towards cleaning up the bowling alleys and so on, and targeting youthful public spaces, which again will be followed through the rest of the century. Okay, so I will end there.
Thank you very much.